At dawn on June 6, 1944, the sea was on fire. The gray waters off Normandy heaved under the weight of thousands of ships, their decks trembling from the recoil of guns that had not stopped for hours. The horizon flickered orange with muzzle flashes, each one echoing across the surf like the heartbeat of the invasion itself. And on the cliffs above Omaha Beach, buried in smoke and screaming wind, stood the 58th Armored Field Battery. They weren't supposed to be there. The map said their position was overrun, their guns destroyed, their men dead. But in a shallow trench filled with mud and shell casings, a handful of British and American gunners, led by Captain Andrew Hawk Merriman, were still fighting, blind through the smoke, firing point-blank into the inferno below. Their 25-pounders had been hit, repaired, and hit again. The barrels glowed red. The recoil sent shockwaves through the earth. Around them, radio static screamed with the same broken message. Omaha sector collapsing, repeat, Omaha collapsing. And yet they held. In that single hour, against the full weight of the German 352nd Infantry Division, this forgotten battery, cut off, deaf to orders, running on instinct, would turn the tide of the bloodiest beach in history. No one would believe their story until decades later, when a shell casing marked 58th Armored, position able, was unearthed in the cliffs above Vierville-sur-Mer, right where history said no guns had survived. The invasion had begun long before dawn, and the men of the 58th Armored Battery had not slept in 2 days. Their convoy, split from the 50th Northumbrian Division during the Channel crossing, had drifted toward Omaha Beach, an American sector they were never meant to reach. When their landing craft hit a sandbar in the early light, machine gun tracers tore through the water like horizontal rain. Captain Andrew Merriman, 34 years old, from Dorset, was the first out of the ramp, chest deep in surf, shouting through the chaos. "Forward! Get the guns off." Behind him, Gunner William Mac McCready and Sergeant Thomas Greaves wrestled the first 25-pounder field gun off its cradle, the steel carriage sinking into wet sand as mortar rounds fell around them. The sky was gray, the sea white with churned foam, the air filled with shrapnel whining like wasps. Men stumbled, fell, crawled forward again. Every few seconds, the world flashed white. The battery's landing had gone disastrously wrong. They were supposed to unload east of Gold Beach behind the British 231st Brigade. Instead, currents and wind had driven them straight into the killing zone of Omaha's western bluff, where the German 352nd Infantry Division had turned every hedgerow into a fortress. When Merriman realized the mistake, it was too late to turn back. The beach ahead was littered with wrecks, burning LCVPs, overturned tanks, bodies drifting in the tide. "Get those guns inland," he yelled. "We hold here or we die here." The men moved like ghosts through the smoke. By 0700 hours, they had managed to drag 2 of their field guns to the edge of the dunes. One of the tractors had been hit, its driver vaporized. The rest of the vehicles burned behind them, ammunition cooking off in violent chain reactions. Merriman climbed the ridge, scanning through binoculars. The German fire was relentless, machine guns chattering from the bunkers at Pointe de la Percée, mortars raining from the high ground. Below, waves of American infantry, men of the 116th Regiment, 29th Division, were pinned down behind the seawall. He could see their desperation, their faces pressed into the shingle, praying for a miracle. He knew then what he had to do. "Range 1400, he ordered. "High explosive, rapid!" The first shell shrieked upward, arcing through the mist. It landed just behind the German strongpoint at WN-70, the blast tearing a section of wire and throwing bodies skyward. The second round followed, closer. Within minutes, the 58th Armored Battery was firing as if possessed, each gun cycling faster than regulation allowed, shells slamming into the bluffs, cutting gaps for the trapped infantry below. The Germans reacted instantly. Counter-battery fire rained down on the ridge, tearing open the earth. One shell hit so close that the concussion lifted Merriman off his feet and threw him into the sand. When his vision cleared, half his crew were down. Greaves dragged him upright, blood on his sleeve. "You're hit," Greaves shouted. "Not dead yet," Merriman coughed, wiping grit from his mouth. "Keep firing!" For 2 hours they fought without pause. The barrels of their guns glowed a dull cherry red. Shell smoke mixed with sea fog until the world became nothing but shades of gray and thunder. Through the din, a young American lieutenant crawled up the ridge, radio pressed to his chest. His uniform was torn, his face blackened by soot. "You British?" he gasped. "Last we checked," Merriman replied. The American grinned weakly. You just saved my whole company." Below, the beach began to move again. Men rising, charging, shouting. The dead tide was breaking. By midday, the battery's ammunition was almost gone. They had started with 500 rounds. Less than a dozen remained. Merriman ordered half the crew to scavenge from destroyed vehicles, crawling across open ground under sniper fire to recover anything usable. McCready was one of them. He found a half-buried crate near the wreck of a Sherman tank, pried it open with his bayonet and carried it back one round at a time. At 12:30, a shell struck gun 2 directly. The explosion blew Greaves backward, shrapnel slicing through his leg. The gun shield was gone. The breech jammed open. Merriman ran to him, pulling him to cover. "I can fix it," Greaves insisted through gritted teeth. "Not with one leg you can't." "Then prop me up and I'll shout directions." Merriman did exactly that. With the sergeant bleeding beside him, he realigned the gun manually, adjusted the sights, and pulled the lanyard himself. The recoil knocked him flat. The shell flew true, right into a bunker mouth halfway up the hill. The explosion silenced the machine gun that had been killing men on the beach all morning. A cheer rose from below. Through his binoculars, Merriman watched American troops storm the breach they had just opened. One of the officers waved up at them, a tiny figure amid chaos, and Merriman saluted without realizing it. When the smoke cleared at last, the ridge was silent, except for the sound of cooling metal. The 58th Battery had fired over 800 shells in 6 hours, many of them from damaged guns held together by wire and prayer. Of the original 70 men, 22 remained standing. At 1600 hours, U.S. reinforcements finally reached their position. A young captain looked at the smoldering field pieces and asked, "What outfit are you?" Merriman smiled, half-conscious, his face streaked with blood and grime. "Wrong beach," he said. "Right place." The sea was retreating now, pulling back into itself with a slow hiss, dragging away the wreckage of men and metal that had once filled the surf. The air stank of cordite and blood, but above Omaha the ridge held them barely. Merriman's 58th Battery was down to one functioning gun, its paint scorched to bare steel, its sight cracked by shrapnel. Yet every man who could still stand worked that gun as though the fate of the war depended on it, because in that moment, it did. Below, the American infantry were still fighting to claw their way inland. German mortars bracketed every movement. Machine guns chattered from farmhouses turned into fortresses. The entire front teetered between triumph and annihilation. The only thing keeping the 116th Infantry from being pushed back into the sea was the unbroken rhythm of the 58th's fire. Merriman crawled up to the lip of the ridge. Smoke drifted over the beach like storm clouds. He could see medics dragging bodies, officers waving their arms through the chaos, men trying to rebuild the courage that hours of slaughter had stripped away. He felt Greaves at his side, his leg bandaged, pale as paper. "We're out of fuses," the sergeant said. Merriman nodded, his voice hoarse. "Then we fire blind." He leaned over the radio, its casing cracked and humming with static. "Red 2 to any station on this net. We are at position able. Battery strength reduced to 1. Request resupply or relief." The reply came minutes later, faint, broken. "Position, unable to confirm. Hold until relieved." The phrase carried no comfort. They were alone, forgotten in the fog of war. By 1700 hours, the Germans began their counterattack. From the woods beyond Vierville, shapes emerged. Infantry in gray, moving low, disciplined, silent. Through the haze, Merriman counted at least a company. He turned to his gunners, half of them barely conscious. "Load shrapnel. Fire when you see the whites of their eyes." The first shell detonated short, showering the field with dirt. The second exploded above the tree line, scattering the advancing line into chaos. The third broke their momentum entirely, cutting the attack in half. Yet the Germans kept coming, crawling forward over the bodies of their dead. Machine gun rounds whipped through the grass, snapping past Merriman's ears. Greaves, braced against a sandbag, kept shouting range corrections, his voice fading into coughs. McCready swung the gun back toward the tree line, hands blistered from the hot metal. "Steady, lads," Merriman said. "They've got to reach us before they can take us." The next explosion sent dirt raining over them. When the smoke cleared, McCready was on the ground, his arm torn open. Merriman dragged him behind the trench wall and manned the breach himself. The rhythm returned. Load, fire, recoil, reload. until time dissolved into the sound of his heartbeat and the roar of the gun. Finally, as the sun dipped below the clouds, the ridge fell quiet. The counterattack had broken. The field below was strewn with gray uniforms, the survivors retreating toward the village. Merriman sank back against the sandbags, his body trembling. The silence after battle was always the loudest thing of all. That night rain fell, a cold, steady drizzle that turned the earth into a mire of ash and blood. The surviving men gathered under a torn canvas. They shared what little rations they had, passing around a dented canteen. No one spoke. The distant rumble of naval guns rolled over them like thunder from another world. Greaves broke the silence first. "Sir," he said, "you reckon they'll come back?" Merriman stared out into the darkness where flashes still bloomed on the horizon. "They always do." He looked down at his hands, black with soot, shaking slightly, and wondered how long before they simply stopped responding. His ears rang with phantom echoes, every heartbeat another gunshot. At 2300 hours, the radio crackled again. "Position able, this is Beachmaster Omaha. Reinforcements inbound." "Hold fast," Merriman almost laughed. The phrase sounded like a promise the sea itself couldn't keep. Just before dawn, a strange stillness descended. The tide had gone slack. The wind carried a faint smell of petrol and salt. Then came the sound. Engines, hundreds of them, rising from the beach below. Through the smoke, shapes emerged. Shermans, half-tracks, jeeps crawling over the dunes. The Americans had broken through. Men on the ridge stood, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Merriman climbed to the gun pit, watching as the first tanks rolled past the craters they had created. A young U.S. captain waved to him from below. "Nice fireworks, Major," he shouted. Merriman managed a smile. "Battery, stand down." But even as relief spread through the men, he felt a hollow weight settle in his chest. They had held, yes, but at what cost? Of 70, barely 20 remained. Their supply trucks were gone, their dead uncounted. And yet, by standing their ground, they had turned the impossible beach into a foothold. He watched the sun rise over Normandy, blood red through the haze, and whispered to himself, "Hold until relieved." For the first time in 24 hours, he believed it might be true. By the second day, the wind over Omaha carried a strange quiet, the kind that only came after too much death. The sea no longer roared with explosions. Instead, it breathed in slow, wounded waves, as if exhausted by the slaughter. Along the bluffs, the 58th Armored Battery held its broken position above Vierville-sur-Mer. The guns blackened, the barrels warped, their crews hollow-eyed and gray from fatigue. The smell of burned powder clung to every surface, seeping into the skin of the men who had survived. Captain Merriman stood at the edge of the trench, his greatcoat stiff with dried blood, his boots sinking into a mixture of sand and ash. Below him, the beach that had once been hell now resembled a graveyard. Landing craft scattered like bones, tank turrets half submerged, bodies lined where the tide couldn't reach. But further inland he could see movement. Thin columns of German soldiers regrouping among the hedgerows, smoke rising from the village of Vierville. The enemy wasn't finished. They were gathering to strike back. The order from command was blunt. Hold the Vierville approach at all costs until armor relief arrives. But no one knew when relief would come. The 58th had already given everything they had. Their ammunition was nearly gone, their medical supplies exhausted. Even the radio, patched together from scavenged parts, barely functioned. And yet when Merriman looked into the eyes of his remaining men, he saw no thought of retreat. At over 7:30 hours, the first German shell came screaming over the ridge, landing short. It threw up a geyser of dirt and metal that rained down across the trench. The second found its mark, slamming into the gun pit, tearing away the sandbags, sending McCready sprawling into the mud. Merriman grabbed him, shouting through the ringing in his ears. "Stay with me, Mac." The answer came as another explosion, closer. The enemy artillery had their range. Vierville was alive again with muzzle flashes. The German 914th Grenadier Regiment advancing in disciplined lines through the hedgerows. Their mortars bracketed the ridge with terrible precision. Every round that landed sent another shockwave through the earth, loosening stones, tearing open craters where the dead already lay. The men of the 58th returned fire with everything left. The last functioning 25-pounder barked again and again, each recoil lifting its wheels off the ground. Greaves limped between gun positions, passing shells one by one. The steel was too hot to touch. His palms blistered. Merriman worked the rangefinder, shouting coordinates, but the air was thick with dust and smoke. He could barely see 10 feet ahead. Through the haze, shadows emerged, German infantry advancing up the slope. Machine gun fire raked the trench, cutting down 2 men instantly. Merriman dropped behind the gun shield, reached for his revolver, and called out, "Fix bayonets!"
"They're coming through!"
The trench erupted in chaos. The British gunners, turned riflemen now, fought like cornered wolves. The Germans hit the first line hard, grenades tumbling over the parapet, detonating in flashes that burned retinas white. The shockwaves threw dirt, limbs, and debris into the air. Merriman lunged forward, firing point blank at a figure climbing the sandbag wall. The man fell backward, his helmet spinning into the mud. "Greaves, right flank!" Merriman shouted, "I'm on it!" But Greaves wasn't. A mortar had landed just behind him, and the sergeant lay still beside the wreckage of the ammunition crate. Merriman froze for half a heartbeat before rage took over. He grabbed the lanyard of the 25-pounder, sighted blind into the fog, and fired. The shell detonated only 50 yards away, right where the German line was thickest. The blast hurled men like rag dolls. When the smoke cleared, the assault had broken. The ridge was theirs again, but the cost was ruinous. Of the original 22 who had survived the first day, only 9 now stood. The radio crackled weakly. A voice came through the static, American, frantic. "This is 2nd Battalion, 116th Infantry. We're pinned at Vierville Crossroads. Any artillery on this net, respond." Merriman snatched the receiver. "This is 58th Armored, position able. We can give you 4 rounds, maybe 5. Make them count." He turned to his crew, the last of them. McCready, face pale, arm bandaged. Corporal Hales, deaf from concussion. And 2 young gunners whose names he barely knew. "Right," he said softly. "For Greaves." They loaded the remaining shells. Each one a prayer, each one a defiance of the impossible. Merriman calculated the range by instinct now. The instruments were all broken. He watched the horizon through the periscope, waiting for the signal. When it came, a flare bursting red over Vierville, he pulled the lanyard. The first shell screamed across the valley and landed directly among the German positions. The second followed a moment later, the explosion visible even through the smoke. The third ripped through a line of trucks attempting to bring up reinforcements. The fourth, fired with a cracked casing, misfired, the recoil slamming Merriman backward. But it didn't matter. Below, American infantry were advancing again. The counterattack had collapsed. The 58th Battery had broken the German flank long enough for the 116th to push through Vierville and secure the road to Saint Laurent. When the shooting finally stopped, Merriman sat beside his gun, breathing hard, the metal warm beneath his hands. The wind carried the faint sound of cheers from the valley below. He looked toward the sea, where ships still dotted the horizon, and felt the first fragile sense of victory. Greaves's body lay beside the shattered sandbags, his hand still clutching the range chart. Merriman folded it and placed it in his own pocket. "You held," he whispered. By evening, the relief column arrived. Shermans from the 743rd Tank Battalion crawling up the road, their hulls streaked with salt and grime. A lieutenant climbed from the first tank, saluted smartly. "Captain Merriman?" "What's left of him," Merriman said. "Orders from Division HQ. You're to withdraw and refit. The 58th is being cited for extraordinary action." Merriman nodded slowly, glancing around at the ruin that had once been his battery. "Extraordinary," he murmured. "A word for men who didn't come back." As night fell, he walked down to the beach. The tide was coming in again, washing away footprints and blood, erasing the evidence of what had happened. But as he looked up at the cliffs, he realized something profound. History would never know how close Omaha had come to failure. It would never remember that for a single day a handful of lost gunners had saved it, and that was fine with him. They hadn't done it for glory. They'd done it because someone had to stand when everyone else fell. The guns fell silent, but the land did not. The ground itself seemed to breathe, a steady exhalation of smoke, ash, and blood from the open wounds of Normandy. The 58th Armored Battery, what was left of it, had been relieved in name only. The reinforcements that reached their ridge were little more than scattered elements of the 743rd Tank Battalion, and a handful of engineers patching through the carnage. The sea behind them was still burning. The sky still growled with distant thunder. Captain Merriman stood at the ridge's edge, his shadow stretching across the broken field below. He hadn't spoken in hours. Greaves was gone. Half his men were buried in shallow graves marked with spent shell casings. The rest wandered in silence among the wreckage of their position, cleaning weapons that had no ammunition left to fire. The orders from division were simple, impossible, and cruel. Advance inland. Link up with the 29th Infantry along the St. Laurent Road. Maintain artillery support for the push. Artillery support, Merriman muttered, staring at their single surviving gun. The weapon looked like a relic already, mud-caked, bent, blackened by heat. Its breech was jammed again, but Macready and 2 others were working on it anyway, more out of habit than hope. By mid-morning, the clouds thickened, rolling in low over the French countryside. The wind carried the distant stutter of machine guns and the faint, ghostly toll of church bells from a village still under occupation. The hedgerows dripped rain. The world was wet and gray, and the men of the 58th moved through it like shadows, silent, exhausted, their boots heavy with mud and grief. They followed the tanks inland, past the shattered remains of Vierville, where every wall bore the signature of shrapnel. Civilians hid in their cellars, faces pale, hands trembling. Merriman gave what little rations they had left to an old woman clutching a child. She bowed without speaking, eyes wide with something older than gratitude. "Keep moving," he told his men. "The front's just ahead, but the front," they soon discovered, was everywhere. By noon, the column reached a crossroads near St. Laurent. The road was lined with the wrecks of German trucks and American jeeps alike, the air thick with flies and the sweet metallic stench of death. From somewhere beyond the next hedgerow came the distinct crack of rifles, close, methodical, too regular to be random. "Ambush," Macready hissed. Merriman raised a hand. "Guns ready. Get that 25-pounder turned around." They wheeled the weapon into position, its wheels sinking into the wet earth. Merriman took a bearing with his compass and set the elevation by feel. "Range 200, he ordered. Before he could give the command to fire, the first burst of German MG-42 fire ripped through the air. The men dove for cover. The round struck the gun shield with a sound like hammers on an anvil, sparks flashing in the dim light. "Return fire," Merriman shouted. Macready swung the gun toward the flashes, yanked the lanyard. The shell detonated behind the tree line, the explosion flattening the hedge and silencing the machine gun. The exchange lasted 10 minutes that felt like an eternity. When it was over, the fields were littered with enemy dead, but 2 more of Merriman's men had fallen. One lay sprawled beside the gun, his hand still gripping the elevation wheel. The other sat slumped against a ditch wall, staring blankly at nothing. Merriman closed their eyes and moved on. The road toward St. Laurent ran between high hedgerows, green walls that hid death on both sides. As the column advanced, they found more signs of battle. Shattered helmets, burnt uniforms, the smell of fuel and flesh. Every step felt heavier. By late afternoon, they reached the outskirts of the village. The fighting here was fierce, close range, brutal. American infantry crouched behind stone fences, exchanging fire with German defenders hidden in the church tower. Merriman reported to the nearest officer, a young lieutenant with dust on his face and a look that had aged him 10 years in a day. "You the British battery from the beach?" the lieutenant asked. "What's left of it? You're a long way from your line." Merriman glanced at the sky. "So are you." The lieutenant pointed toward the church. "They've got an MG nest in the belfry pinning down our whole flank. We can't move an inch until it's gone." Merriman nodded. "We'll take care of it." The 25-pounder was dragged into the street, its wheels grinding over cobblestones. Civilians huddled in doorways as the crew set the gun's trails. Merriman took aim at the tower, adjusted the sight, and gave the order. The round screamed upward, struck the belfry, and exploded in a blossom of dust and smoke. The bell fell seconds later, shattering in the square. The gun fired again. Another roar, another concussion that rattled the windows for blocks. When the dust settled, the tower was gone. The MG fire had stopped. American troops surged forward, cheering. Merriman slumped against the gun, too tired to smile. Macready clapped him on the shoulder. "Not bad for a dead man's battery." Merriman managed a faint grin. "We're not dead yet." But as the day bled into evening, the truth was undeniable. They were running on ghosts and grit alone. Every man moved like a sleepwalker, every command spoken through the fog of exhaustion. When the last of the Germans withdrew from St. Laurent, The survivors of the 58th gathered in the church square. The rain had stopped and the air smelled faintly of salt and smoke. Merriman looked at the sky, the clouds tinged red with the last light of day. "We hold here tonight," he said quietly. "Then we see what's left of the world tomorrow." The men nodded, too tired to answer. They stacked their rifles, covered the gun with a tarp, and lay down among the rubble. The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time in 48 hours, there was no gunfire, no screams, no orders, only the distant murmur of the sea they had come from. Merriman closed his eyes, but the sound of the tide was wrong. It wasn't waves. It was the echo of guns repeating over and over as if the land itself refused to forget. The dawn broke gray and cold over St. Laurent, its light spilling across a landscape that looked older than time, the kind of silence that only follows a battle too large for memory to hold. Smoke still rose from the fields beyond, where tank carcasses lay in heaps of blackened steel and the hedgerows were shredded to bare roots. The 58th Armored Battery, once 70 strong, now numbered 6. They had slept on the stone floor of the ruined church, surrounded by the dead and the dying, their bodies shivering even under blankets, stiff with grime. When Captain Merriman woke, his neck ached, his throat was raw, and his first instinct was to listen, not for birds or wind, but for the guns. There were none. Only the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the rubble, marking time for men who no longer believed in it. McCready was already outside, sitting on an overturned ammunition crate, his boots steaming in the morning chill. "You hear it, sir?" he said without turning. Merriman frowned. "Hear what?" "Nothing. That's the part I can't stand." He was right. The silence was unbearable. It was not peace, just the breath between storms. From the east came a column of American trucks, their engines coughing through the wet air. A major from the 29th Infantry dismounted, clipboard in hand, looking like a man already late for another war. He saluted briskly, barely meeting Merriman's eyes. "Orders just came down. You're to reattach with the British 50th Division, moving toward Bayeux. They'll need forward artillery by nightfall." Merriman stared at him, unblinking. "We have one gun. Half a crew." The major shrugged. "Then you make it count. That's what you people do, isn't it?" He climbed back into his truck and drove off without another word. McCready spat into the dirt. "Bloody Yanks," Merriman shook his head. "No, he's right. Get the gun ready." By mid-morning they were on the road again. 6 men, 1 gun, 1 truck that coughed smoke like an old dragon. The countryside passed in slow, trembling frames. Apple orchards riddled with bullets, barns split open by tank shells, the ghostly shapes of cows wandering between craters. Every village they passed looked half alive. Women staring from windows, children clutching tin cups, old men standing beside ruined wells as if waiting for the world to remember them. Merriman sat in the cab beside McCready, map unfolded on his lap. "If the 50th is moving toward Bayeux, they'll hit resistance near Point 103. It's high ground." McCready grinned faintly. "We've a habit of liking high ground, don't we?" "Until it kills us," Merriman said. The gun rattled behind them, bouncing over the stones, its barrel pointing skyward like a grave marker. When they reached Point 103, they found the 50th Division already in heavy combat. German artillery from the far ridge was pounding their advance, pinning them in the open fields. Tanks burned along the roadside, sending up pillars of oily smoke. The radio channels were chaos, overlapping voices, orders lost in static. Merriman climbed out of the truck, scanned the horizon, and saw the enemy battery dug into a line of trees nearly a mile away. "That's our target," he said. They unlimbered the gun on the slope, its wheels sinking into the soft ground. The crew moved like ghosts, no need for orders anymore. They had done this too many times. "Range 1600, Merriman called. 2 rounds, quick fire." McCready slammed the shell home. "Ready?" The first shot cracked through the air, its recoil throwing mud and smoke around the pit. The round struck short, exploding harmlessly in the field. Merriman adjusted, sighted again. "Add 50. The second shell landed dead center. The explosion was enormous. A fireball that lifted one of the German guns into the air. The crew roared, their exhaustion burned away by a single perfect shot. Merriman's face stayed calm, his eyes fixed on the smoke. "Keep firing," he said, "until they're gone." They fired again and again, the gun growing hotter, the ground trembling beneath them. The smell of cordite mixed with earth and rain. For a moment, Merriman could almost believe they were whole again. The 58th as it had been before Omaha, before the sea turned red, but war doesn't give moments without taking something back. A counter battery found them minutes later. The first shell landed behind the truck, shredding its rear axle. The second came closer, showering them with shrapnel. Merriman was thrown to the ground, his ears ringing. When he looked up, McCready was gone, only a dark smear where he had stood. He crawled to the gun, half blind, his hands shaking. "Keep firing!" The remaining crew obeyed. 3 men now, then 2. Then 1. Merriman pulled the lanyard himself, his body numb, his voice hoarse. "For the 58th!" The gun answered like thunder. The last German position went silent. Then the ridge went quiet forever. By evening, the field was littered with twisted steel and empty shell casings. The British 50th broke through, their infantry sweeping past without realizing who had cleared the way. A colonel found Merriman hours later, slumped beside his gun, his hands black with soot. "Good work, Captain," the colonel said softly. "You held the line." Merriman didn't respond. His eyes were open, fixed on the horizon where the sun bled out behind the trees. The colonel turned to his aide. "Mark this position. 58th Armored Battery, temporary emplacement. Extraordinary action." The aide nodded and scribbled it into his ledger. Then they moved on. No one ever came back. Years later, when the war was a story told in classrooms, a French farmer clearing his field near Bayeux found a rusted artillery piece buried beneath the grass. The barrel was cracked, the wheels long gone, but on its breech someone had scratched 2 words with a bayonet. "Hold. Always." He sent word to the British consulate, but no one knew the unit. No one could find the names. The archives listed the 58th Armored Battery as lost, presumed destroyed, June 1944. But under the soil of Normandy, the metal still slept. When the wind blew from the west, through the wheat and the wildflowers, you could almost hear the echo of a single gun firing from a ridge, the forgotten heartbeat of men who saved a beach, and then vanished into history's silence.